When I first went into medicine, I didn't always want to be a doctor, by the way, a medic. I wanted to be a lawyer up until I was about 15, and then my interest in science really spearheaded my interest in becoming a doctor. But at the same time, I was wanting to go into medicine, become a doctor, as well as the science interest, I was also very interested in people and helping people. So, okay, that's fine. Most doctors are interested in science and helping people. I went to medical school and I kept the same ideas. And then I went to medical school in Cambridge University in the UK. And what was so good about that, the course there, was that you were given an opportunity to do a year something completely different from medicine. So I chose zoology, which might seem a bit of a left field choice, but the reason I chose zoology, I was fascinated with how the brain could generate certain behaviours across different animals. So I got to know a lot more about brain circuits, neural circuits and behaviour and the relationship in simple animals like sea slugs and things like this. And that sparked my interest in the brain and behaviour. But at that point, I decided I wanted to be a neurologist because I thought, brain, behaviour, that must mean neurology. So I went through medical school, finished medical school, and I went, and after my intern year, my house officer year, which was called in the UK, I went into neurology for 6 months. And it was around that time, that I realised, actually, I want to understand the brain basis of complex behaviours that we see in depression, psychiatric illness. At that point, we're talking in the early 90s, very little was known. Neuroimaging, fMRI really wasn't mainstream research at all, very primitive types of imaging, but it fascinated me, this relationship between brain and behaviour in complex systems. Complex systems, a human being is complex behaviours. So I switched and I moved into psychiatry for that reason. And then in psychiatry, I was very fortunate to be there at the time that fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, was developing. And I was able to use fMRI and start to examine the brain basis of emotion, human emotion. And that's where it started. But it really stemmed from my interest in the brain and behaviour, wanting to help people. I also have to say, on a personal note, I had a very good friend who went into psychiatric nursing. Unbeknownst to all of us, she had very severe bipolar disorder, and she ended up killing herself in the early 90s, when about the time I was specialising in psychiatry. So it kind of crystallised all at the same time. I really wanted to stop people committing suicide. My research really focuses on understanding the brain circuitry underlying emotion processing and emotional regulation and sensitivity reward processing across the spectrum of people who are healthy and who've never suffered from any psychiatric illness, right up to people who suffer from terrible psychiatric illnesses such as bipolar affective disorder, depression, etc. And what I'm trying to do is identify the specific abnormalities in the brain circuitry underlying emotion and reward that underlie the development of the key behavioural and clinical problems that people with these severe illnesses have. So that's one aspect, that's, if you will, the kind of here and now. But what I also do is I go back in time and I use these tools and techniques, neuroimaging techniques, for example, behaviour probes, and computational techniques to develop ways of identifying younger people who are at future risk of developing these terrible illnesses based on their patterns of brain response and structure. And then ultimately, what I've been doing, and more recently, is developing new interventions guided by understanding of these neural abnormalities, new brain stimulation interventions to try and develop new treatments to help people with these diseases. Highlights from my career. Well, I have to say, being president of biological psychiatry has been a very interesting and rewarding journey. It's not so much a highlight as a 2-year platform of light. So it's been very rewarding. Obviously, it takes a village. Lots of people I've worked with. So that's been very rewarding. But I suppose on some of the earlier highlights, getting my first paper published. I think that's a highlight for everyone. For me, I was fortunate enough to publish. I did a master's in neuroscience when I was wanting to be a neurologist. And my first paper was published in the journal Brain, and I was so proud of that. And it was just one paper. But I think that was a real highlight. My first neuroimaging paper, I was fortunate enough to published in Nature. So that was a big highlight. Getting my first grant. Going to my first conference. My first proper conference was actually a schizophrenia conference. And the people I met there, colleagues I met there, have been friends for life. And in fact, one of them there, the very first person I met there, is a colleague here in Society of Biological Psychiatry right now. And I talk with him most weeks now. So I think, it's a combination of products, achievements, but also making those key friendships, those collegiate relationships, and then they become friends for life. And then, just meeting more and more people, it sort of snowballs from then. And you almost create your own community within the larger science community based on your personal connections. So many highlights. And of course, in science, we also have so many rejections as well. We have papers rejected, we have grants rejected. You have to learn to kind of be thick-skinned and learn from the rejections and focus on the positives. Like 90% rejection, 10% positives, but it's worthwhile because of what you achieve in the end. So what makes me feel empowered the most? Well, I think in terms of the empowerment and the rewarding experience of that, I think finding something out, discovering something new, or just discovering something that builds on other findings that are already out there. That's so incredibly rewarding, and then you're feeling that you're able to do something. So in my case, I want to stop people with bipolar disorder killing themselves, or I want to find a treatment that prolongs, prevents, or delays, or we hope ultimately prevents people from having a manic episode, for example, or depressed episode. That's so rewarding and fulfilling and empowering. But I think perhaps the most rewarding of all, as I said earlier, is the mentoring and feeling that you've made a difference, not only to patients' lives and to the science community in general, but to actually other human beings whom you know, because you've helped facilitate their careers. And then, you can see them grow. And I think that's so rewarding. You're making a contribution to the scientific community via helping other people develop. And, if that's not rewarding, what is? So the advice I will give junior scientists now is don't focus on the negatives. Don't focus on the rejections. It's so easy in science to get so miserable, so upset, taking it personally when your paper gets rejected. I remember when my first paper got rejected with some pretty snippy comments. And of course, I took it personally. I was very upset. But then you learn not to, because it's part of the process. And you learn to navigate that field. So I think it's not so much developing a hard skin, it's developing a sense of perspective. Of course, you can only have that when you're then rewarded for something else. You can't continually be punished and never have anything accepted and still be happy. Of course not. So I think the advice I will give is develop a sense of perspective, get a great mentor, get a great advocate, know how to seek them out. Don't be afraid to do things on your own, like going to conferences on your own. That's what I did. My first time in biological psychiatry, I came on my own. And that's how I met people and got a friendship group together, got very collegiate colleagues together, got a mentorship group, a sort of a peer mentorship group. I think that's the other aspect, peer mentorship. All of these are easier said than done, but it takes time, but those are the key things. And for women, it's especially important because the implicit biases will come back if there aren't enough women there at every level being promoted. So getting a peer group, a support group, getting a peer mentorship group, getting a good advocate, going to conferences, not taking things personally when things get rejected, that is so important.